इयं विसृष्टिर्यत आबभूव यदि वा दधे यदि वा न यो अस्याध्यक्षः परमे व्योमन्सो अंगम वेद यदि वा न वेद. Welcome back to Civilizational Bridge. I'm your host, Hemanth. Today's episode is a special one, not just because of the topic, but because I'm joined by someone very close to me, my brother, Ravi Teja. Here he is tuning in from India. He shares a deep interest in history, politics, and how India is represented, especially on the global stage. Today we are diving into a curious and frankly controversial claim made by US President Donald Trump. After the recent India-Pakistan 4-day war that followed the Pahalgam attack and subsequent airstrikes, President Trump publicly took credit for brokering the ceasefire. Many of us, even here, found this baffling, if not outright disrespectful. As someone based in the US, I saw how such statements can go unquestioned or even amplified by mainstream media. So today, Ravi and I are going to unpack this moment not just as a geopolitical event, but as a lens into how India is perceived, misunderstood, and sometimes even co-opted in Western political theater. And we'll also talk about what this means for the Indian diaspora, how narratives shift across borders, and at what it means to truly own our civilizational voice in a multipolar world. Stay tuned as we bridge perspectives from India and the US and dig deep into the rhetoric, the reality, and the responsibility of shaping our own story. Ravi, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Hemanth. And it has been a great day being here. And I have followed all of my brother's videos, and it is a great honor to be on this show. Thank you very much.
So, Ravi, how was, from what I narrated, how was Trump's claim of brokering a ceasefire between India and Pakistan received in India at the time? Were people even aware of it? Does it matter? Did it matter?
It did matter, but not in the way people have analyzed, especially in the US from an Indian perspective, where the narrative and other things, at least the understanding was clear because the primary players are based here. Indian armed forces have acted with restraint, and there was a good coordination between the political forces and the armed forces, and the diplomacy and was managed through back channels mostly. There was some American intervention, but I wouldn't take it to the level of intervention. Trump's claim was seen as out of his place, but it was seen more as a bombastic statement from him. It is not technically a ceasefire, it is only a cessation of hostilities, because a ceasefire will require an agreement to be signed by both the parties and go on. For example, there has been a cessation of hostilities with South Korea and North Korea since 1952, but there is technically not a ceasefire because there is no agreement between the Koreas to say this is the board. There is no formal agreement between them, and that is why it is technically called that Korea and the Korea.
It's just an understanding reached without actually a ceasefire agreement, which needs certain types of changes along the boundary or something like that, right?
There is an agreement basically stating, hey, this is where it is. So, for example, the 1971 Shimla Agreement, there was a demarcation of the border between India. After the 1945 war, World War II, there was a formal agreement between the Soviets and Germany where there was an official ceasefire. So these kind of, the Versailles Treaty was another kind of a ceasefire. So you have these formal agreements when a war ends. However, right now there is only a cessation of force. And there is also, for example, let me go into how we believe, for example, what was the direct impact of the statement, what we think was the motivation behind the statement, and what was the work being done. If I take the view of the direct impact of the statement, it was more about the understanding across the channels that US is still its role might be unclear. It might not be defined clearly, but US is still a player when it comes to this particular word. You need to also understand that, for example, China's role in this has been dim. China, which was acting, Pakistan, which was playing against US and China, basically with this gesture has shown US is the bigger player in this area than China.
How do you see that?
So if you want to talk to two people and somebody comes in the middle, at the end of the day, that player shows that player has the influence. So which player has showed them? Whom did, for example, Pakistan reach out for such an? It didn't reach out to China. So there is that influence as well, that basically saying it is that indirect impact, which basically says China, you have no major role in a conflict.
But technically speaking, broadly, almost even before Donald Trump, every US president has inserted themselves into India-Pakistan conflict.
Yes.
How is this different?
So the difference is in, for example, the amount of effort which China has put in the last 10 or 15. Let me take a historical perspective before I go. India after independence and US after the 1945 when it was going into Cold War was looking for an alliance. India with its colonial experience didn't want to go into an alliance structure where its interests were subordinated to somebody else because it had that experience recently and it was not good for it. So it didn't. Whereas Pakistan, which always was talking about its geopolitical place in the world, was the first to go into an alliance with US, with the Seattle. Now, when you go into an alliance with Pakistan, immediately it basically said to India, hey, you're not part of my alliance, because alliances are kind of, you're joined at the head.
You become a client state. When you're a small country, you become a client state to a bigger power.
You are a client state, and also please understand there was already the 1948 invasion of in Kashmir by the Pakistani army led by using the tribal. So it was understood that in the Indian circles, US might not be the player you want to put your bets on. We wanted to be multipolar, or at that time what was called as non-alignment, but this also gave us, hey, should we even think about them as our primary ally? So there was that particular call which Nehru had. Also, when you take into account the major players surrounding India from a land perspective, the Soviet Union had borders until Tajikistan, which bordered Afghanistan, and the Jammu and Kashmir, if you see the actual boundaries, which is part of the POK, Pakistan occupied Kashmir, it had a border with Afghanistan, and it was just a small valley which separated it. Okay, so there was this kind of conflict as well. And India had an interest to make sure that China and Russia do not combine forces, because the entire Eurasian plate would have been under one centralized.
But they cannot quite come together, right? There is this theory that when you have neighboring countries, powerful countries, they can never be really friends per se, because there will always be some kind. We know that there is a boundary issue between even China and Russia.
So this was, when I'm talking about Nehru, I'm talking about in the 1950s to 60s. At that time, the Sino-Soviet split did not. The split happened in the 60s, post-Stalin era, and post possibly somewhere in the Khrushchev era and the Brezhnev era was when the split happened. It was officially made after the Cuba War, when you think about it from the perspective of US Soviets. Until then, there was a huge collaboration between the Soviets and China, and India was trying to play against. This meant India had to play with China because the play with Soviet, because the Chinese factor was already there. And so these were the two things which India was trying to do. This meant the natural ally for us at that time to keep China in check was actually the Soviets. Before we took that decision to go with the Soviets, America had already played its cards to align with the Pakistanis, because they wanted access to the Afghanistan from where they could base their long-range bombers and their reconnaissance aircraft to monitor the Soviets. So these places were this thing. And I wouldn't say that the Indian diplomacy at that time, or even the US diplomacy, let us agree that at that time India was a second-rate or a third-rate power, and US primary interests were always on the Europe plate, where it was facing the Russian Cold War directly. The other areas of interest were subordinate to those. So it was kind of disinterest. The second-rate players were looking at it. They were trying to see how they could use the geopolitics of this particular plate to use there. So these all factors played a role.
Interestingly, I would say that it is on either side of India. They were playing a part in Vietnam. They were playing a part in Korea on that side, on the side of the Pacific, and then on the other side, Cuban missile crisis happened.
Cuban missile crisis.
So you have a South America as well that was very active.
Yes. Don't forget the Iranian intervention in the 1956, when Prime Minister or President Mossadegh of Iran was over with the help of CIA, and the Shah was reinstalled. So US was playing all these games, playing one against the another, trying to make its alliances more secure. That is part of the national interest.
Obviously they
But
have to be one up against, they have to be one up against the Russian force. I mean, Russia was a big
yeah,
player. Maybe economically as well it was powerful enough, and militarily obviously it was a great power at that time.
so all of this came into this thing where it affected the Indian interests. This was where, for example, a alignment of interest between India and US didn't occur, and so we kind of were like those neighbors who hated each other, who just said hi, but were colluding. India had no much interest in US. What changed in the 60s was the Sino-Soviet split. The Sino-Soviet split happened when at that time, the 1965 war with the Seattle Alliance and also the Chinese war forced us to kind of pick a side. We couldn't be non-aligned because we were not in that state. We had continuous droughts for 2 years. We were hand to mouth. Our security risk was threshold. We had 2 wars in that, and we were facing the Bangladesh crisis, where 5 million people, 4 million people were coming into us as refugees, with brutal massacres of Hindus happening at that time. So there was no way in which we couldn't react, and it came to a place where India had to pick sides. We picked a side at that time with the Soviet-India Friendship Treaty. Please note, even at that time, we said no to an alliance. India said no to alliance.
No, now tell me, Ravi, what do you say about the hyphenation that Trump does between he draws an equivalence between India and Pakistan. India is a $5 trillion economy now, or a $4.5 trillion economy now, while Pakistan is in dire straits. They've just got an IMF loan, a bailout loan for $5 billion to be paid over 5 years or 7 years. I don't know the time frame exactly, but they are basically begging. And you have a war between India and Pakistan, while President Trump, he kind of hyphenate and says India and Pakistan, I worked with them and secured this ceasefire.
Okay, so let us go into the hyphenation when it was placed and how it was actively removed and what is the present status. So the hyphenation was started sometime in 1950s. I would say that the Indus Water Treaty was the first case where the active hyphenation had enhanced. Indus Water Treaty was the treaty where, for example, the eastern rivers or the tributaries of Indus River, which started mostly in India and went to Pakistan via some part in the Pakistan occupied Kashmir, the eastern rivers were given wholesale to India, whereas the western rivers, even though the huge catchment area was actually in Indian Kashmir and India, was given Pakistan. The dams and other things which were built were provided, the money for that was provided by India and the world. So even the dams, the Talabag and the Kalabag, and there were two major dams built for that at the canals area. These canals, interestingly, one of it was the Ichogil Canal, which they had planned in such a way that this was also militarily defense. So India built in some ways the military defenses of Pakistan. Anyway, that's a side story, but the hyphenation started there. And at that time, remember that Ayub Khan was the dictator of Pakistan. US didn't like, for example, Ayub Khan, but they have worked with it and they were giving full-scale arms. And that was the confidence based on which they invaded India. And this hyphenation started at that time because India was also very, very in dire straits. As I told you regarding the continuous 2-3 year drought in the 1966-67, when we were shipped out, where the US grain was given to India, but they were given on very humiliating terms, and it was mostly, unless you do this, accept these terms, you will not get the next ship. Okay, so India at that time was basically saying to itself, hey, we will not do this again. That was when, for example, if the Prime Minister of India, Lal Bahadur Shastri, coined the slogan Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan, which was basically hail to farmer, hail to the military, hail to the soldier. And we went on to make a grain revolution with actually the US help, where we introduced hybrids and high yielding hybrids to increase our yield to become more food sufficient.
Especially in Punjab and other areas. Yeah.
Punjab and other. But the hyphenation now the hyphenation continued in the 1970s decade, when still US was leaning towards Pakistan. We did the 1974 explosion, which basically made against them, against
now
US.
you're going into Now let me ask you a question. You are digging into the history and saying the hyphenation started there. Hyphenation now, why? Why do we have a hyphenation between India and Pakistan today when it no longer matters and India is so far ahead of Pakistan? Does it have something to do with the personality of President Trump, you think?
The hyphenation doesn't matter because the scale and size of India has exceeded something like 10 times the size of Pakistan. India is somewhere near that size. So, in terms of actual power, the influence of geopolitical influence, we are far exceeded. But where it is still an hyphenation is because of the nuclear conflict and the Goldilocks thing which the US has. When I use the Goldilocks term, India has been US has been that benevolent dictator to India. To what this means, US doesn't want India to die. US doesn't want India to prosper on its own. It wants to be. It has during all this phase when the hyphenation phase occurred, US had wanted India to be on that famous dialogue of Pran, liquid oxygen. Oxygen will not let you die, liquid will not let you live. Which is basically you can grow at that per capita income, per capita growth, where the population growth is equal to or less than your per capita, but you wouldn't be given any facilities. You wouldn't be given the freedom, the strategic freedom to operate how you want
Yeah,
and
I
you
mean,
keep your defense
it
expenditure
made
high.
sense. See, ideally, what you would want to do is you want to grow and keep the power. Keeping the
With
power
yourself.
is the most important for yourself, is the most important objective of any superpower. They
Yes.
want to preserve the power at any cost.
Yes.
Now, it also makes sense that they would only allow some client states to prosper because you need to trade with them and some client states to fail, right?
Yes.
Or some client states to be if they are not client states, you really don't want, I mean, you don't care. You are equivocal about whether you want to, allow a country to grow or not. So it made sense. It all made sense. Now,
Definitely.
today, I'm talking about today. Why?
Even
Why did Donald Trump, why did President Donald Trump decide to hyphenate or I mean, nobody in the administration seems to, say, Mr. President, you cannot say it that way. Who is the aggressor? Who is the victim here? We keep on hyphenating between India and Pakistan. If we do that, then we are not giving due importance to our trading part. And you are saying you want to put trade. Does trade even matter? Trade. I mean, your carrot of trade. Does it matter?
So let me reverse this question.
Okay.
Okay. So when I talked about the Goldilocks principle, where India would be allowed to grow only to certain level beyond where it can breathe, but it cannot think of freedom. How was it achieved? It was achieved by using Pakistan. It was the
Sure.
strategic strategy. Now,
That's fine.
India has broken through some of these chains, especially with the 1991
Sure.
reforms. Now, if we think about the hyphenation, let us understand, or let me ask you a counter. When do you think, what is this hyphenation and where did it actually start?
Well, to me, it actually doesn't matter if in history, if you hyphenated two countries because they were probably at the same level at that point in time. And a lot of presidents and people in America grew up with this understanding that if there is something that you hear from that part of the world, India, Pakistan, war, they always talk about India, Pakistan and cash. All these three things always come into the picture. And so there is always this idea that whenever it is India, you have to also use Pakistan. In the past, in fact, most presidents who came to India also went to Pakistan. Barack Obama was the first president who actually broke that protocol and only visited India. Before that, Bill Clinton visited both India and Pakistan. Now, that hyphenation doesn't mean anything anymore because India has grown too big for Pakistan to be hyphenated with. Pakistan is in dire straits, like I said, and India is a growing power with a 4 to 5 trillion dollar economy. And so when you hyphenate, it hurt me that you are equating India and Pakistan together, even though Pakistan is an aggressor. India is the victim. Here, all this happened because of the massacre that happened in Pahalgam, where the tourists were asked about their religion. They were not only asked and identified by religion, they were asked to read a kalma, which is a prayer in Islamic practices. And even if you read kalma, if they were doubtful, They asked people to remove their pants to see if they are circumcised or not. They identified them that way and killed them in broad daylight. There was no way for security forces to come at that. And so it was natural because of the past experiences that India had with Pathankot, Uri. No, there were several terrorist attacks you can name. Over history, there have been so many terrorist attacks, and all of them, or most of them, emanated from Pakistan. Especially, in the context of Kashmir, if there is a terrorist attack, there is some root in Pakistan. And so it doesn't make sense when President Trump calls Prime Minister Modi as his good friend, when he doesn't have his old friend Imran Khan anymore in the picture, hyphenate both these countries together and say India and Pakistan have been fighting for centuries, and then he said decades, and then now he's saying that they were on the brink of nuclear war. So I told them that I give the carrot of trade, stop, and they stop. That is his claim.
Okay, so in a way, what you have said is absolutely right. But where does so if I decode what you're saying, the hyphenation hurts the Indians and the Indian diasporas in two ways. It basically creates a propaganda issue where the victim is treated along with the aggressor, along with the terrorist. The victim is equated with the terrorist.
On par
With the terrorist. The second equation is, for example, the mind space which India and Pakistan and the diaspora occupies is kind of conflict. And what you're saying is, hey, let us divest. Okay. So in theory, I do agree with you, but I will. This is not, for example. Let me explore it in a certain way, so as to go to a nuance of this. It doesn't affect the direct person who is actually doing this. It affects the overall trade. It affects the overall issue. Overall perspective, overall direction of, for example, when I want to investment, it doesn't hurt the hard realities as such. So the hyphenation for us has been for Indians has been a historical baggage since the 1940s. It is for us to basically say we ignore that because US has a interest to create that. As we were discussing, the hyphenation only exists in the minds. It is an imposition on India. Now, India needs to say to others, hey, we don't care about hyphenes unless you think of, for example, you are hyphenated in some way and ask that is where the hyphenation matters. But it is on India's duty to basically say it doesn't matter. Trump is not a person who goes into those details. Trump is that flowery person kind of hand waves things. Now, when you're hand waving this kind of stuff, you're asking for a nuance from which, if you see his first statement, Trump, by the way, has made two statements. One, where he hyphenated, calling that, hey, I'm the great champion and have created the ceasefire. And after the Indian pushback from a diplomatic way, which was in a very, very conscious but a professional way, he has then said, we will offer to her. So he has already backtracked. What is it? And we didn't do it in a way where how Canadians did it, where, for example, Trudeau was basically summoned to his house and made to resign. It was not that kind of public humiliation in it. It was a subtle diplomatic way. Now, let me ask you a question in all of this, Hemanth. You know that President Trump made an announcement and took credit. India has already rebuffed that sequence of events and gave its own version that Pakistan has reached out to India for a potential ceasefire via Trump. I'm sure President Trump's ego might have been hurt somewhere, and he has already issued statement. There was a backtracking statement from him, but there is also another statement from him asking Apple to not set up plants. How do you think both the offer of the trade which he has given to India and the previous discussions have come out, and how do you think this might play out? How do you think India should?
So India today is not the India of yesterday. India's leverage, it has grown, and India is being seen as a critical supply chain alternate. You see, America wants to supplant China and move the supply chain somewhere. Of course, you can move it to Vietnam, you can move it to other countries around the area, South Korea, but it is not nearly enough. You don't have that much workforce to supplant China. The biggest workforce around that area is in India. Absolutely in India, there is no other alternative. Now, as far as Trump's reaction is concerned, well, I mean, he reflects transactional, kind of transactionalism. He doesn't get if he doesn't get symbolic even credit, he will retaliate economically. But I think India should stay firm, should be diplomatic, but it should also leverage and assert its independence. with in Russia-Ukraine war. They've already asserted some kind of independence in terms of the foreign policy. Now, let's see what's Apple's India move. What did it mean? Was it strategic or was it political? Well, it is strategic because it's driven by labor cost. You don't have the same kind of labor costs you make in America. If you make the same iPhone in America, that iPhone will cost you $10,000. $10,000. If you make it in a country where the labor costs are low and the supply chain is resilient, then Apple will make money, will make a buck out of their iPhone. Otherwise, there is no chance Apple will make a buck out of it. Now, what does India have to do in all this? I think we need to continue improving the ease of doing business. If you want to set up a business, you should be able to do it without many of the red tape that we have in our country. It's a test of India's maturity. We are no longer a passive participant. We have agents. The question is, can we use that agency wisely, a bit assertively, and not fall into the ego games of other powers? I mean, yes, dealing with President Trump can be tricky, but India has to show maturity in dealing with, and you have to improve the ease of doing business. There is no other alternative. I think Prime Minister Modi knows it, and we have to get ourselves out of the way. In fact, mostly we have to get our bureaucracy out of the way to be able to deal with President Trump's ego. Okay, now I have a question for you. I have an interesting question for you. From a civilizational perspective, how should India respond to such interventions? Ignore, reject, or co-opt? I mean, we were talking offline and you reminded me of a story from Mahabharata, which we could draw some parallels from. Now, I will please answer that. Please tell us the story and draw parallels. That's a very interesting story that you've talked with me offline.
Sure. So this is a story from Mahabharata, one of the largest epics of the Indian culture and religion. The story is of Ekachakrapuram, which is a quiet village. It was terrorized by a demon, Bakasura. Now, to survive, the villagers struck a very terrible bargain. Every family in turn would send a cartload of food and a human, which the demon will devour and eat them, everything. So every family had to send at their chance one person, one adult from there. There was no resistance, no fight, just fear and fatalism. Until one day, a new family's turn arrived. And at the same time, that family was hosting the Pandavas, and the Pandavas were in disguise as Brahmin. And Kunti, the mother of the Pandavas, offered her son Bhima to go in place of the host family's child. And what follows is transformed. Not just of fate, but the narrative, the future of that. Bhima doesn't play along to be eaten by the Bakasura. He confronts and he challenges Bakasura, destroys Bakasura, he breaks the cycle. Now, this is the agreement which Pakistan wants to impose on. Let me kill a few hundred or so Indians regularly, or we will use nuclear black. We as Indians have to become Bhima to tackle Bakasura and the scourge of terrorism for once and for all. We have to end this.
I have to tell you, this is an excellent story that we can all relate. Maybe we can find some equivalence between actors. And let's do some thought experiment and let's talk about who are the real world equivalents. You said Bakasura is Pakistan.
Definitely, it's
right?
Pakistan.
The rogue actor.
And it is demanding every turn one person as the appeasement under the threat of violence under the nuclear.
Okay. Now, what about the village? What is the village?
Village is the Goldilocks principle or the South Asian global order which was shaped post 1945. It is the India itself which is bound in this strategic strategy act.
Are you saying India is the village?
It is the global order. The village is the global order in which all of these people coexist. It is the embodiment of Pakistan.
You said though Bhima is India, right? You said Bhima is India.
Bhima is the transformation of.
Okay.
It is the new India.
Makes sense.
So it is the global order.
It's a change that came about.
It's a change
in terms of the person who was sent to tackle the Bakasura. Okay. All right.
And USA played the role of those village elders who were bartering with Bakasura, who basically were prescribing stability over justice.
Okay.
And also trying to make sure that the costs of this was borne by somebody. some lower families which were not alike. So they were the
And what would you then what would you say the role of Kunti is? She sent her own son. What was she doing, and who is she? I mean, what is the parallel we have?
she plays the most important role. Imagine her.
Okay.
She comes to this village and she's being hosted. She's not of this village. She is just being hosted by this family. She takes the decision that instead of the host family, she will send her son to be sacrificed.
So you are saying
moral compass?
it's the moral compass.
It's a
Okay.
moral
Okay.
compass. It's the civilizational dharma which says you need to be righteous, you need to be assertive of your powers. It is that righteous assertiveness which takes hold, which is that moral compass which guides. It is the destiny, or whether you want to make that moral calling, or whether you want to be in that bondage which others have tried to impose.
Okay, Ravi, let's stop here because this is an excellent answer, and we want to stop it here because we want people to, really enjoy this particular analogy that you've drawn between the story of the Bakasura and the story of Pakistan. I would say Bakasura is Pakistan. My fear all along has been that you are equating Bakasura with Bhima. You cannot say Bhima and Bakasura. We've created a truce between Bhima and Bakasura. And hopefully there is some learning here, and we can hopefully help the village elders learn that we should not be drawing an equivalence between Bhima and the Bakasura. So
The villagers and the Bakasura.
villagers and the Bakasura.
Bhima was the change. Kunti was the change
Change
agent.
agent. Okay. So thank you, Ravi. Thank you again. It's a fantastic conversation. Viewers, if you are interested in such great conversations, which I certainly enjoyed, please stay tuned. Like, share, and subscribe. From both of us, you will be getting perspective of middle class in the US, one being in the US, me, and the other one who is in India, Ravi, who understands the ground situation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all. Have a great day.